feeding the 8,000. I like to say it that way because it confuses people. Everybody knows about feeding the 4,000. But the point is, if you'll discover that that's counting the men only, which was their style. So how many people were really there? Well, you got to multiply that probably by 2, maybe 2.5, depending on how you want to count. So it's an estimate. So this is not to be confused with the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6. Now, it's typically called the feeding of the 5,000. It probably was 10. And this is the feeding of, sometimes called the feeding of the 4,000. I said 8,000 just to keep you on your toes. There were 5,000 with Jesus only one day there, and here they're with them 3 days. Their other details are also varied between these two feedings, what they started with and what they had left over, plus some other things. And Jesus' declaration in verse 19 will prove conclusive when we get there. But also they were distinctively different groups of people, by the way. This is often missed by many commentators. The 5,000, back there in chapter 6, were exclusively Jews. It was a Jewish crowd. The 4,000 here were fed in Decapolis, which was a Gentile area. Yes, there may have been some Jews, but it was characteristically a Gentile area. That's where we had the feeding of the swine and all of that, the deviled ham as we call it, so forth. So let's just jump into Mark chapter 8, first few verses. In those days, the multitude being very great, and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples unto him and said unto him, I have compassion on the multitude, because they've now been with me 3 days, and have nothing to eat. Wow. Do you often go 3 days without eating anything? They apparently wanted to be with him very badly, be out in the wilderness with no obvious provisions. And Jesus said, if I send them away fasting to their own houses, they will faint by the way. For divers of them came from afar. In other words, they've come too far to try to go back without victuals. That's the idea. And so that's all pretty straightforward. Jesus is always touched by the need of the multitude. You always see his compassion, especially in the Gospel of Luke, by the way. But for 3 days they flocked about him and absorbed his teachings, but he's now concerned that they have something to eat because it's been quite a while. And his disciples answered him, from whence can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness? You know, they're out in the woods. There isn't a hot dog stand nearby or whatever. He asked them, how many loaves have ye? They said 7. Wow, that's more than he had the last time, isn't it? Right? Okay, 7. This time there are more loaves for fewer people, but it was still true. What are these among so many? He commanded the people to sit down on the ground, and he took 7 loaves and gave thanks and brake and gave to his disciples to set before them. And they did set them before the people. And they had a few small fishes. And he blessed and commanded to set them also before them. So they did eat and were filled. And they took up of the broken meat, food. The word meat there really is the Old English for food in general. The broken food that was left 7 baskets. And the word baskets there is actually hampers full. It's a large kind of basket is the term that's being used there. So they started out with 7 loaves, and they now have 7 baskets left over. So this is obviously a miracle here. And they have 7 baskets left over. Now, in chapter 6 of the feeding of 5,000, there were 12 hand baskets left over. And the kophinos, which is a basket as it was the kind you'd carry if you're traveling on foot. In other words, small baskets. Here you have 7 hampers full. These are large baskets, such as often used for carrying commercial goods. Spur, it's a different Greek word used. It's a plated reed basket, a wicker hamper in effect. So that they had a lot left over. These are large enough to hold a person, because the same term is used for the basket through which Paul escaped from Damascus in Acts chapter 9. So this is an interesting event here. See, much of this was intended to be instructional for the disciples themselves. Jesus wanted the disciples to understand several things. First of all, that he, Jesus, was the bread of life. And he elaborates that, of course, in John chapter 6. And he deliberately identified himself with the manna, the bread from heaven, which is the episode in Exodus chapter 16. You want to remember that, by the way. You know, the law came in Exodus 20. In Exodus 16, they were observing Shabbat before Exodus 20. The law was not, the Shabbat was not established in the Ten Commandments. It was just included as a reminder. And that may affect your perspective of all of that. Now, he's also the bread of life, as, you know, Bethlehem is place of birth. Bethlehem, house of bread, is what it means. And it echoes this very emphasis. And this also underscored this at the Last Supper. Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. There again, the bread of life echoes through his ministry here. It's interesting in Proverbs 30, you may recall, the first few verses, if you translate it properly, you discover it's a messianic prophecy by Solomon, that God arrives to be consumed. Strange term, but in effect expressing this same idea, that Jesus is the bread of life. And he's there, he came to be consumed in that sense. And now much of this was intended to be instructional to the disciples themselves. Jesus wanted them to understand that he wanted his disciples to understand that he was not only the bread of life for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. Remember the temptations. Man does not live by bread alone. Also, the supply always meets and exceeds the demand. When God guides, he provides. Whatever the Lord has given us, there is still far more for him to give us still. You can't run him dry. What a God we serve. You see, our souls are elastic. They can absorb more than we probably allow them to be absorbed. Anyway, continue verse 9. They that had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Again, this is the Jewish reckoning, the 4,000. They actually counted only the men, so the actual crowd was larger than that would imply. Matthew 15, verse 38, emphasizes that. Beside women and children is the annotation in Matthew. So you can probably figure it was about twice, maybe more than twice that number. Not 4,000, but maybe 8 or 10, something like that.